Hi everyone and welcome on board your really long-haul flight. On this channel we've put together a compilation of some of the most jaw-dropping moments from the sky, so now all that you need to do is find a comfortable place to sit, bring out your favorite drink, sit back and relax. One of the most time-critical decisions a pilot will ever take under normal circumstances is to reject a landing from low altitude or on the runway. But what if the aircraft in that situation refuses to follow the pilot's commands and instead does something completely unexpected? Stay tuned. Aircraft today are built to amazing safety standards, and the certification process is now so detailed that it's almost impossible to grasp. On top of that, new requirements are added every time an incident or accident happens where a design weakness is uncovered. But no matter how detailed these certifications are, it's impossible to cover every single scenario, especially if outlined standard operating procedures are not completely followed, and this incident is a great example of that. On the 8th of April 2022, a crew from TAP Air Portugal was getting ready to operate a flight from Lisbon in Portugal up to Denmark and Copenhagen Airport. Since this was in April, spring had started to come to Lisbon, but the weather in Copenhagen was much less predictable, with strong, gusty winds, forecasted showers and a temperature of only a few degrees Celsius. This weather is typical for Scandinavia during April. In Sweden we actually have a word for it, aprilväder. And for pilots, this type of varying weather conditions can present several different challenges. In this case, the winds were forecasted to be blowing from 270 degrees at 20 knots, gusting up to 32, and since the runways in Copenhagen were oriented in either a southwesterly or northwesterly direction, this would mean that all runways would be subject to strong, gusty crosswinds. The runway, which was closest to the wind direction, was also the shortest one, runway 30. So this was the runway that the pilots of this flight was expecting to get. The captain was 40 years old and had logged about 10,000 hours of total time. Out of those, he had flown around half on the Airbus A320, which was also going to be the type that they were operating on this day. The first officer that he was going to work with was 34 years old and had flown a total of 3,160 hours, the majority of which, over 2,000 hours, was on the A320 as well. Now, given the weather they were expecting in Copenhagen, coupled with the relatively short runway, they decided that the captain would act as pilot flying on the way up, which makes perfect sense to me. It is not uncommon that the captain will choose to operate flights who are a little bit more challenging, since the responsibility ultimately rests with him or her. After the pilots had looked through their weather, they continued their free flight by checking through the flight plans, their NOTAMs and the technical notifications about the aircraft, but once they were finished, they proceeded by briefing their 5 cabin crew colleagues and then walked out to the apron to start their day. The aircraft they had been assigned for the flight was an Airbus A320-214, and according to the tech log, it was in very good flying condition. When the Airbus A320 family had been certified, it had come with 2 engine options, the International Aero Engines 2500 and the CFM56, which was the option fitted to this aircraft. This engine, and especially certain components of it, will become really important for this story, but I'll explain more about that later. The first officer completed his walk-around as the captain was setting up the cockpit, and during that walk-around the first officer had noticed nothing out of the ordinary. Meanwhile, the cabin crew welcomed the 102 passengers on board, and once everyone was ready and the pilots had completed their pre-flight, the aircraft was pushed back and then started its engines. After having received their clearance, the pilots then taxied out and departed towards the northeast according to their flight plan. Everything was working completely normal at that stage. During the flight up towards Copenhagen, the pilots had plenty of time to look into the expected landing conditions in a bit more detail. Given that there were rain showers in the area, sometimes even containing snow, they assumed that the runway would be wet, which would mean a braking penalty and therefore an increased landing distance. Runway 30 was 2,365 meters long, but it only had 2,095 meters available for landing due to a displaced threshold. Now, that's not a lot of runway, but it wasn't terribly short either, especially since this flight only had 102 passengers on board, but the gusty winds made it a bit more complicated. You see, when we land on short runways, we typically want to use as much flaps as possible to lower our approach speed and provide more drag. But on the 737 that I fly, if we use higher flap settings, we typically also have less margins up to the flap overspeed, since more basically is just hanging out, making it more sensitive. With less landing flaps, like flaps 30, it's a bit more stable to fly, and we therefore tend to use that for landings in very gusty conditions. But according to my Airbus friends, the Airbus A320 is actually a bit more stable with full flaps and doesn't have much less margins to overspeed either. So that makes the choice of flaps that these pilots ultimately decided on a little bit harder to understand. Now, there was a note in their manual saying that pilots should still consider using less flaps in gusty conditions, so maybe that was the reason behind their choice. I don't know. In any way, records show that they performed 3 different landing calculations, each with different autobrake and flap settings. Eventually, they decided to go with flaps in configuration 3, meaning 20 degrees of flaps and autobrake medium. Now curiously, that was actually not one of the combinations that they had calculated with, but it would still give them a landing distance of 1,540 meters, which was well within the available distance. They had made a calculation with flaps config 3 and low autobrake, which gave them a landing distance of 1,930 meters, and that likely made them a little bit uncomfortable given that they only had around 2,000 meters available, so increasing the autobrake, even without making a further calculation, would be logical. Now, I mentioned before that the pilots were expecting gusty crosswinds for the landing, so now it's probably a good time to explain why that would be a potential problem. In short, as pilots, we don't really care about crosswind when we're flying at higher altitude, since up there it just means that the aircraft will have to point its nose into the wind in a way that guarantees that the intended track is being followed. And that wind correction angle is the difference between heading and track, by the way. But when it comes to the takeoff and landing, the aircraft all of a sudden have to adapt to land on a strip that is fixed in a certain direction on the ground. This means that we have to maneuver the aircraft to align with that final approach track, just like you would do in a boat who needs to cross a river to a specific mooring on the other side. As we approach the runway, we would point the nose into the wind to ensure that we keep following that final approach track, just like that boat would need to point its bow into the stream of the river to do the same thing. This is called establishing a crab angle, and it's very effective as long as you just need to get the aircraft down to the runway. But once you're over the runway, you can't really land with this crab angle in, or at least not the full amount of crab angle, as this would cause a lot of strain on the landing gear. So therefore, we need to decrab or align ourselves with the runway just before landing. This is especially important on dry runways, as on wet and slippery ones there will be a little bit of less side forces if you do land with a crab. But in any case, as soon as the aircraft decrabs, it will start to be pushed by the crosswinds towards the downwind runway edge. This decrabbing therefore must happen quite late in the landing sequence, meaning that the pilots often will have to combine both the decrabbing and the flare at the same time, which can be a little bit tricky. Because of this, basically the need to maintain directional control and to stay on the runway, aircraft are restricted to a maximum amount of crosswind. That tends to be in the region of 30 to 35 knots or so, reducing if the runway becomes more slippery, since the directional control then also becomes harder. So as you can see, a crosswind landing is a technically quite tricky maneuver, which is why less experienced pilots might have further restrictions on the maximum amounts of crosswind that they are allowed to land with. An aircraft might, for example, be restricted to 30 knots, but an inexperienced pilot might only be able to do 15, and these type of restrictions often differ between different airlines. But even experienced pilots will have to be very focused when they fly approaches with crosswind close to maximum, and if you add that those winds are then gusty as well, it obviously becomes even more complicated. And if you on top of that have to then land on a short runway as well, well, then you can be quite sure that whoever has the controls will be on their highest alert and will be trying to apply all applicable techniques to get that aircraft down safely, quickly, and to bring it to a stop as quickly as they can. The latest weather the pilots received was ATIS Information Charlie, which was recorded at time 0956. It indicated that runway 30 was in use as expected, with a wind from 250 degrees 24 knots gusting 29. This would have given an average crosswind component of around 20 knots. The report also mentioned that there was storm clouds in the vicinity of the airport and that a combined snow and rain shower had passed the airport just 10 minutes before the aircraft was expected to land. Having said that, the visibility and cloud layers were good, and all in all there was nothing stopping the pilots from actually starting this approach. So the captain just briefed the first officer for a standard ILS approach into runway 30, and once that was completed, the crew asked air traffic control for initial descent, all according to their normal procedures. Now, before we get into the incident sequence, I promised earlier to explain a few technical details about the CFM56 engines fitted to this Airbus. In essence, apart from some minor differences in fan diameter and construction, they were the same two-shaft high-bypass turbofans which are being used on the Boeing 737NG that I fly. But there was one major difference. On the 737, the thrust reverser system is compiled by hydraulically operated translating sleeves, which, when activated, changes the direction of the air running through the bypass duct into a forward direction. But on the Airbus engines, this same effect was accomplished by the help of 4 pivoting blocker doors instead. These doors were also hydraulically activated by separate actuator arms for each door, and they were secured in the locked closed position by both a tine inside of the actual actuator and a separate hydromechanical primary door latch. These latches and activators were controlled by something known as the Engine Control Unit, ECU, and it was depending on several digital inputs like the sensed thrust lever angle in the cockpit, signals from the position microswitches in the reverser doors themselves, and most importantly, the air-ground sensing signals from the weight on wheel switches inside of each main landing gear. Those switches would activate when the shock absorbers compressed after touchdown and was one of the required signals for the function of the thrust reversers, both for activation and deactivation. Now, the reason that there were 2 separate locks fitted to the reversers was because of required changes that came after the terrible accident of Laudair 004, which I've actually covered in an earlier episode. Those upgrades should in theory have made in-flight reverser deployments impossible. Now, in order to actually activate the reversers, the Airbus pilots had to pull up 2 flaps on the front of the thrust levers and then pull the thrust levers further back beyond the forward thrust idle position. Provided that the ECU then felt that the aircraft was on the ground, it would initiate the unlocking and activation process of the blocker doors, and after that was complete, start spooling up the engines to provide the reverse thrusts. Now, those of you who have been following this channel for a while know that a go-around can be initiated at any point, up until the reversers have been selected. But once the reversers have been selected, the pilots are completely committed to the landing, so a go-around is no longer an option. But even though you might have heard that before, you might not know why that is. And by the way, if you haven't been following the channel, then what are you waiting for? Subscribe now. Anyway, there are several different reasons why we should never go around after having selected reverse thrust. For one, it will actually take a relatively long time for the aircraft to go from reverse thrust, then deactivate and lock the reversers, and then spool the engine up again if go-around is requested, meaning that there might just not be enough thrust available quickly enough to safely execute the go-around. But equally important, you never want to put the aircraft in a position where you risk activating full forward thrust on one engine while still having low or even reverse thrust on the other. This has actually happened on Pacific Airlines Flight 314, which crashed at Cranbrook International Airport in Canada back in 1978. And ever since that happened, this rule of never attempting to go around after reversers have been selected have been strictly enforced by pilots on all aircraft types around the world. The Cranbrook accident also changed the certification requirements for transport category aircraft to make sure that an aircraft could always both land, select reversers, then stow them again and apply takeoff thrust with both reversers deactivating safely, even though that should never happen. These new rules were applied in Canada first, then by the FAA in the United States, and even though the exact same rules were not implemented by EASA in Europe, in effect all aircraft manufacturers still follow them. But compliance with these certification rules were only really tested on aircraft after they had fully landed and selected reverse thrust. Remember that. TAP Flight 174 was eventually given gradual descent clearances down towards Copenhagen, and a few minutes past 10 UTC, they were handed over to the Copenhagen approach controller, who started vectoring them for the ILS approach for runway 30. The pilots had completed all relevant checklists by then, except for the landing checklist, so the captain started asking for flaps to be extended, and around 10 o'clock, the aircraft had fully intercepted the ILS and started descending down towards the runway. The weather on approach was turbulent, but well within the capability of the pilots, and at time 10:01 and 55 seconds, the landing gear was selected down, shortly followed by the flaps being moved into the landing position, position 3. They were now completely configured for the landing when the pilots were handed over from the approach controller to the Kastrup tower controller, but before that handover took place, the previous controller also asked the crew to try to vacate the runway via taxiway Delta. This would make the available rollout distance even shorter, 1,530 meters to be exact, and the crew commented on this being a little bit much to ask for. But a request from the tower is nothing more than just a request, and if the aircraft is not able to do that, well, then that's just the way that it is. But we pilots always try to comply with those kind of requests if we can. It's likely that this request was made to try and minimize the aircraft's time on the runway, as Copenhagen was using only runway 30 for arrivals at this time, and the pilots likely knew that. Anyway, as this was happening, the aircraft descended through 1,420 feet, and the captain suddenly decided to disengage the autopilot and continue the approach manually. Now, the autopilot can be used much lower than that, even past the minima if needed, but it's pretty common that we pilots disengage it a bit earlier when the weather is bad. We tend to do this to try and get a better feel for the aircraft and prepare for the manual landing that's ahead, but it's also just because it's really fun. At time 10:05 and 5 seconds, the tower controller cleared TAP Flight 174 for landing runway 30. The aircraft was now fully ready for landing, and with the gusty winds and the tower controller's request in the back of his head, it's very likely that the captain was very focused on getting the aircraft down correctly, on the mark, and get the brakes and reversers working as soon as possible, especially with the wet runway that he could now clearly see ahead of him. The approach continued in a stabilized manner with only minor speed deviations down past the threshold, where the GPWS started calling out
50, 40, 30, 20, 10, retard.
And at 30 feet, the captain started the flare and also simultaneously straightened the aircraft out from the crab. His hands were just resting on the reverser flaps at this point, and as soon as the wheels started spinning up, even before the shock absorbers had properly compressed, he pulled up the flaps and then pulled the thrust levers back into reverse thrust. Now, as I mentioned before, the reversers would only activate once the weight on wheel switches were also fully activated, which also soon happened, meaning that the reverser doors now started opening on both sides. And at the same time, the spoilers also activated on the wings, bringing the weight of the aircraft down onto the shock absorbers and the brakes. But probably due to the strong crosswinds, the aircraft now also started drifting and rolling a bit to the right, causing the left landing gear to slightly get airborne again for just a fraction of a second. The captain didn't like this rolling and drifting motion at all, and he therefore, instead of continuing the landing, instead now started executing an immediate go-around, also known as a balked landing. Like I said at the very beginning, a balked landing is a maneuver which requires a lot of firm but also delicate handling. This is to avoid over-rotating and possibly causing a tail strike, or in this case even a wing or nacelle strike, since the aircraft was in a right bank. It's also important to make sure that the aircraft has the correct speed and attitude to safely get airborne again, but as he now moved the thrust levers from reverse thrust into full toga thrust, something very strange started happening. Because this decision had been taken in the middle of a shallow bounce, when the left gear was in the air but the right was still touching, a difference of commands were now sent from the ECU to the thrust reverser circuits. In the case of the right engine, since the weight on wheel switches were still activated, the stow commands were sent and locked into the execution memory for the computer for the next 8 seconds, causing the reversers to stow as designed and then start increasing the forward thrust for the go-around. But for the left engine, the same commands were also received, but since its main gear was indicating airborne during exactly the 180 milliseconds that this command was given, it was not locked into the memory and therefore not executed. This meant that 3 out of the 4 reverser doors now remained open, creating more drag as the engine was commanded into full forward thrust. Both weight on wheel switches soon activated again as the aircraft continued its initial bounce, but since the commands had already been sent, this didn't change anything. In the cockpit, the first officer had not had time to call out either reverses unlocked or spoilers before the captain had made the decision to go around, so it is possible that the captain wasn't even fully aware that he had activated reverses when he took the decision to instead go around. But let me take this opportunity to reiterate: never try to go around after the reverses have been selected. Because what happened now was like a scene taken straight from a fiction novel. As the right engine started spooling up, the left engine was thankfully inhibited from doing the same, since the system felt that it still had the reverses deployed and therefore activated something known as auto idle. This fact was likely the one thing that saved the situation from becoming immediately catastrophic, but it was still pretty bad. An enormous amount of asymmetric thrust from the roaring right engine and the now idle left one now started affecting the aircraft, causing an immediate yaw and roll towards the left. The captain, who was not prepared for this at all, started trying to control the aircraft, but obviously didn't react with inputting right rudder fast enough. This meant that the aircraft was now lurching towards the left runway edge, with its left wingtip only feet away from hitting the ground. At the same time, the first officer had noticed that the go-around maneuver had been initiated and had therefore selected the flap lever to position 2, which was the go-around setting. The aircraft bounced once again before the nose slowly lifted just enough to get it airborne, meaning that it just barely cleared the left edge of the runway, but still without climbing much. The captain was still struggling to try and understand why his previously fully functioning aircraft was now almost unflyable, and on top of that, the slip and skid indicator on his primary flight display, also known as the beta target, now also stopped working and was replaced with a flag. This indicator normally shows if the aircraft is slipping, meaning turning with too little rudder, or skidding, meaning turning with too much rudder, and it's very helpful when dealing with asymmetric thrust, as it will show the pilot how much rudder to input to fly the aircraft correctly and thus enable it to climb. So that indicator would have been really helpful here, but unfortunately an internal setting in the computer of this indicator was set to inhibit if the thrust reverses was selected. In any case, the aircraft now continued, barely flying out over the safety area next to the runway, and managed to gain just enough altitude to not slam into the glide slope antenna for the opposite runway. At that stage, the pilot judged that they had enough positive climb rate to retract the gear, which the first officer also did. He then called out "Go around" to ATC, and at almost the same time he also noticed an Engine 1 reverser unlocked warning on the aircraft's ECAM display. He called this out to the captain, who now finally got an explanation to why his aircraft was behaving the way it did. He reacted by input about half deflection of right rudder and then raised the nose to 12.5 degrees, which is normally the climb attitude to keep in case of an engine failure after takeoff. This finally got the aircraft climbing again with about 1,000 feet per minute, but it still passed only meters over the houses in a nearby village. As it finally reached about 300 feet of radio altitude, the captain made a mayday call to Kastrup Tower and requested to climb straight ahead to 3,000 feet. Now, as I have pointed out before in many of my previous videos, even though the urge to communicate might be very strong in situations like this, it's probably better to adhere to the golden rule of aviate, navigate, and then communicate here. Because ATC does not need to know that you're going around when you're at 10 feet, nor that you have an emergency at 300. It's better to just concentrate on flying the aircraft at that point and get it safely away from any obstacles and terrain. Anyway, the request was obviously approved by the tower. The aircraft continued to climb, and as soon as it was deemed appropriate, the first officer then started actioning the ECAM actions for the Engine 1 reverser unlocked warning that they had. This included shutting down the left engine completely, which they did as the aircraft passed about 1,200 feet climbing. When that was done, the beta target indication then suddenly reappeared again. Better late than never, I guess. The captain now proceeded with re-engaging the autopilot and continued to climb to 3,000 feet in order to prepare for the next step. Now, before I tell you the end of this story, I want to take the opportunity here to point out a few very important things. This incident highlighted a previously unknown weakness in the Airbus ECU reverser logic on Airbus A320s with the CFM56 engines fitted. A modification is now being worked on to solve this issue, and the same goes for the problem with the side slip or beta index. But having said that, Airbus also looked through all of the available data that they had from more than 95 million flights with this particular aircraft type, and it seems like this was the only time that this particular fault had ever occurred. But what they did find when they were looking through that data is potentially much more worrying. You see, it turns out that the instances of pilots landing, selecting reverse thrust, and then still choosing to go around happen about once every 1 million flights. Now, that might sound very rare, but with the amount of flights that we're operating with the Airbus A320, at the moment at least, that means that this is happening on average once every month. And remember, this investigation only involved the Airbus A320. Given that this rule of never going around after thrust reverses have been deployed is common for the whole airliner world, and that we all of us pilots react pretty much the same to the same conditions, this could indicate that this same thing is happening on all fleets and therefore represents a very real risk, possibly a bigger risk than I have ever seen in the context of these investigations before. So if you are a pilot out there and you want to take one thing away from this video, it should be: if you have landed and selected reverse thrust, you are staying on the ground. A rejected landing is no longer an option. And if you're an airline safety manager out there, I would encourage you to fit these parameters into your OFDM system. Landing, reverse thrust selected, and then go around within the next 10 seconds. It would be really interesting to hear what kind of information that type of check will bring, because it is possible that we have a real problem on our hands here. Anyway, the crew of Flight 174 eventually leveled off at 3,000 feet and then completed the associated checklist. They then briefed their cabin crew and passengers and returned for vectors into a successful single-engine landing on runway 22 left in Copenhagen, about 20 minutes after this terrible ordeal had started. Now, they chose that runway because it had an available landing distance of 3,300 meters, which was significantly longer than runway 30, which they had previously used. Extra distance is something that's really needed when landing single engine, since the approach is flown with lower flap settings and therefore higher speeds. After they had landed, the aircraft taxied into the stand and all 109 passengers and crew could safely disembark the aircraft. Both the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder was successfully saved and downloaded, and together with films from surveillance cameras around the airport and witness testimonies from the pilots, this story was later put together piece by the investigation team. Now, I have already mentioned some of the safety recommendations that came out of this investigation, but on top of those, it was also recommended that the certification requirements for new aircraft should be updated once again. This time with the requirement that the reverse system must be able to completely and successfully be cancelled, not only after a successful full landing, but also during a worst case scenario with a bounced landing. Because of this, aviation is now taking one more step towards further improving safety, and that's without anyone getting hurt, which is the best kind of steps. Becoming a pilot is for many people a lifelong dream. To be able to touch the clouds and feel that awesome raw power of the engine surging through you on a daily basis is something that they just have to achieve. But what happens when the pinnacle, the crowning of your pilot training turns into an absolute nightmare? Stay tuned. On the 28th of February 2018, a group of eager type-rating students were getting ready for one of the biggest highlights of their career so far, as they met out outside Tallinn Airport in Estonia. They had just completed a grueling 2 months of theoretical and practical simulator training on the Airbus A320, and it was now time for them to finally fly the real aircraft. You see, in order to become a commercial pilot and fly with passengers in Europe, a pilot student must first go through initial training. This includes flying in smaller single-engine aircraft up until they complete a skill test for the commercial pilot license, and that normally takes around 200 hours of flight time plus loads of theoretical exams. Now, once that's gone, the student also needs to get certified to fly multi-engine aircraft in instrumental conditions, and once those skills have also been verified, it's time for something known as a multi-crew coordination, or MCC course. In the MCC course, the students will be instructed in the skills of flying in a multi-pilot cockpit, which is radically different than flying by yourself. But even after that course is done, the training journey is still far from over. The last step is to do what's known as a type rating, which is where the students learn the specific technical knowledge, handling characteristics and procedures of the aircraft type that they will actually fly in their new company. It's, by the way, in this part of the training that they would get into contact with me, as I'm a type rating instructor and examiner, and me and my colleagues will then prepare the students for the job that they will be expected to master in their coming careers. The type rating training is started by a technical course, followed by procedure instruction in a fixed space, meaning a non-moving simulator, and then the handling and emergency training is completed in a Level D full flight simulator, which acts extremely similar to the real aircraft. But once the type rating skill test is completed, there's still one more step that needs to be done, and this is known as a base check or base training. So what is that then? Well, before the first flight with passengers, every type rating student needs to have done at least 6 approved landings and takeoffs in the real aircraft with a type rating examiner. So this is what this group of 4 students were now about to do, the crowning of their type rating and the first real step in their professional pilot career. They were greeted at the Tallinn airport by the 63-year-old type rating instructor and examiner who was going to conduct the training with them. And together with him, they walked into the crew room to start planning for the flights. Inside of the crew room, there were already 2 more people waiting for them. A 34-year-old first officer, who was going to act as safety pilot in case something would happen to the captain, and a CAA representative, who was going to follow along to observe the training process. The instructor captain in charge was a very experienced pilot, with over 24,000 hours of total time and 13,500 flown on the Airbus A320. The safety pilot who was going to support him had around 3,000 hours in total, which was enough for the role that he was being scheduled for. Now, as for the students, well, they were completely new, with only around 220 hours of total experience. Now, I know that a lot of my American colleagues out there will be shocked when they hear this, but in Europe it is quite common for low-hour cadets to go straight from their flight schools into the right seat of an airliner, since we don't have the 1,500-hour requirement over here. Now, obviously, this base check is not the end of the training for these students. It will just enable them to continue their line training with qualified training captains. But after a successful base check, the type rating will be added to their license, and they're officially allowed to operate with passengers on board. Anyway, the instructor started the preparation with going through the weather for the day, making sure that it was good enough for the exercises he was planning. A base check is a series of touch-and-go landings, meaning that the aircraft will be flying circuits around the airport, and the landings tend to be done with different flap settings to make sure that the students understand the different handling characteristics. In the case of SmartLinks, the minimum requirement for each student was 5 touch-and-goes, followed by 1 go-around, and then 1 full-stop landing before it was time to switch over to the next student. The weather was okay, with some scattered clouds at 1,100 feet, good visibility, and a wind of 070 degrees, 9 gusting 15 knots, and a temperature of minus 13 degrees Celsius, so it was a bit crispy. The runway in Tallinn is oriented in an almost straight east-westerly direction, so the wind was acceptable as it would only cause a few knots of crosswind. The aircraft that they were going to use was one of SmartLinks' regular Airbus A320-200s, which had been taken out of production on this day to enable the base check to take place. It was 18 years old and in full working condition, at least as far as the crew could see from its technical logbook. Now, the fact that this aircraft had to be taken out of service to facilitate this training obviously came with some quite a significant cost to the airline, and on top of that, the weather had to be good enough and the schedule had to fit the instructor. So once this check was underway, it is likely that the instructor felt a little bit of pressure to make sure that this was fully completed. Anyway, once the weather briefing was completed, the instructor proceeded with briefing the students about the patterns that they were going to fly. I will not go through the whole circuit profile here, but what is going to be really important for this story are the actions that the pilots have to do from final approach and once the aircraft is on the runway, since a touch-and-go landing is very different from a normal landing. According to the Airbus Flight Crew Training Manual, the procedure looks like this. Once the aircraft is turning final, the landing flaps must be selected and the captain would run through the landing checklist. He would then remind the students to not apply brakes and reverses, as doing that would lead to a full stop landing. The aircraft would then need to be fully stabilized from at least 500 feet above the runway and then flown to a hopefully successful nice landing. Once the aircraft touches down, the trainee would make sure to nicely land the nose wheel and the captain would then disarm the spoilers and call "stand them up." The trainee would then move the thrust levers up to about mid-position to avoid the engine spooling down, whilst concentrating on also tracking the center line. Meanwhile, the captain would select flaps 2, reset the rudder trim if needed, check forward movement of the stabilizer pitch trim, and then call "go." When that order is given, the trainee would move the thrust levers into the toga detent, and once that's done, the captain would verify it and call "thrust set" and then rotate once the speed accelerates past the approach speed bug. This will then be followed by a normal rotation, and once airborne, the gear will be retracted, and after this, the aircraft will be climbed to between 1500 and 2000 feet for the next touch and go. Now, as you can see, this is a hugely intensive exercise, but it's also close to about as much fun as you can have in a commercial airliner, and I still get goosebumps just thinking about my own base check. In my case, back in the day, we actually used to not have to do the full stop, so we changed over whilst the aircraft was still airborne and on downwind. Now, I still remember that cockpit door opening up, me being called in, strapping into the seat, and then looking out over my right shoulder, and for the first time seeing that massive wing instead of a black simulator wall. Absolutely fantastic. Now, what's about to happen in this story is among the most technically complicated things that I've ever attempted to explain, so you're going to have to bear with me through a couple of system descriptions. But before we reach that, remember what I just told you about what the trainee and the instructor had to do during the circuit? Well, that description was taken from the Airbus Flight Training Manual, but SmartLynx had not included that exact profile in their own flight crew training techniques manual. Specifically, there was no mentioning about arming or disarming the spoilers in the company-specific version, and that will soon have some wild consequences. Once the briefing was complete, all 7 crew members walked together out to the aircraft. Now, this was the first time that the type-rated students had a chance to see and touch the actual aircraft in real life, and the instructor started by doing a full walk-around with all of the students to highlight important things that would be hard to have time to explain during the hectic line training that would soon follow. Meanwhile, the safety pilot went into the cockpit and started setting it up to a limited extent so that when the captain arrived with the first trainee, they would have saved some time. Once the exterior inspection was finally completed, everyone boarded the aircraft and the first trainee sat down in the right seat with the instructor captain to the left. The safety pilot was seated in the left jump seat behind the captain and the CAA representative in the right. The pre-flight procedures were completed according to standard operating procedures, and at time 10:02, the trainee first officer asked Tallinn ground for startup clearance, and a few minutes later they started taxiing out for takeoff. Once the before takeoff checklist was completed, the captain lined the aircraft up on runway 08 and gave some final instructions to the first officer for the first takeoff. Once that was completed, the first officer took over the controls, moved the thrust levers forward into the toga detent, and that caused the almost empty aircraft to quickly start accelerating down the runway. They took off normally, retracted the gear, and climbed up to about 1500 feet before turning right for the first circuit. Everything was working normally at this point, and the captain concentrated on following the procedures whilst also instructing the first officer on what to think about during the first landing. Like I mentioned before, this was the first time that the trainee would have ever been in control of such a large aircraft outside of the simulator, and in those situations it's easy to get slightly emotional, which can obviously affect the outcome. Anyway, before we continue any further, there are a few things that you need to understand about the Airbus A320 for this story to make any kind of sense. Let's first start with the fact that this is a fully fly-by-wire aircraft, meaning that all flight control inputs the pilots are making will be routed through several computers before the commands are translated into actual movements of the flight control surfaces. Now, this is generally an excellent system, which both saves a lot of weight and it also adds significant safety features to the aircraft. And that is because the computers will not allow the pilots to exceed certain limit values or overstress the airframe under normal circumstances. But as anyone who's ever owned a computer knows, they sometimes fail, and in order for a simple or even double computer failure to not affect the safety of the aircraft, robust redundancies have also been built into the system. I'll give you one example. When the pilots want to move the aircraft nose up or down around the pitch axis, the aircraft uses the trimmable horizontal stabilizer and the elevators in the aircraft tail to achieve this. If the pilot moves the pitch trim or the side stick to tell the aircraft to pitch, these signals are then in flight sent to a computer known as the Elevator Aileron Control, or ELAC2, which will then send the signals onwards to one of the 3 electrical trim motors and 2 of the hydraulic motors controlling the stabilizer jack screw and elevators. All of the flight control computers have both a command channel, which is executing the pilot's commands, and a monitoring channel, which is monitoring the outputs to make sure that everything is working correctly. Now, if a failure of any sort would affect the ELAC2 computer, the system will automatically shift controls over to ELAC1, which will do the same job like the previous computer, but using different electrical motors to do it, making sure that everything still works. But the redundancy doesn't stop there. If ELAC1 would also become faulty, the commands are then shifted over to another computer known as the Spoiler Elevator Computer, or SEC2, and if that one would also get bust, it finally shifts over to SEC1. For the pilots in the cockpit, the only thing that they would notice if flight control computers would shift over is a small jerk in the controls, but if multiple computers would start failing at the same time, something known as a degradation in control loss might also happen. If, for example, both ELAC would fail simultaneously, the system would go from normal law over to something known as alternate law. And if further failures would then continue, the system would finally degrade into direct law. So what does that mean then? Well, in normal law, the Airbus avails of all of its pre-programmed protections that I mentioned before. The pilots can control the aircraft with their side sticks, and the flight control surfaces will position the aircraft proportionally to the stick inputs irrespectively of speed. If the system will then regress back to alternate law, certain protections will be lost, like the max roll protections for example, but the aircraft will still behave largely in the same way as in normal law. But if the aircraft would go into direct law, the auto trim function will be lost, meaning that the pilots would need to trim the aircraft just like we do in the Boeing, and on top of that, the flight controls will start to move exactly like the pilots indicate, without any protections. Now, if the aircraft would degrade into a lower law, it will always let the pilots know about it through a single chime in the cockpits, together with a master caution light and ECAM messages on their screens, explaining the problem and what the pilot needs to do. But these cautions were programmed to only activate above 1500 feet to avoid distracting the pilots at lower altitudes, and that's worth keeping in mind. I know I've mentioned these laws in many of my previous videos, but in this case we will soon get to see a part of this system which very few of you have ever heard about, and it's quite terrifying, but I'll get to that later. What's also worth knowing about the system is that it will transition between something known as in-flight mode, flare mode and ground mode during a normal landing, and it will start transitioning to ground mode about 5 seconds after the aircraft senses touchdown. Once the ground mode is activated, the auto trim system will start moving the trimmable horizontal stabilizer to 0 degrees in order to prepare for the next flight, and this is something that we don't want to do when we're practicing touch and go landings. It's super important that the trim is set at more or less the correct value when we rotate for the next takeoff. And in order to make sure that that was the case, the captain was planning to grab the trim wheel with his hand as it was being moved forward. By doing so, he would activate an override mechanism in connection with the trim wheel, which would stop the resetting and leave the trim set correctly for the coming rotation. And this will also become important. So the aircraft was now entering downwind for the first touch and go. The captain completed the after takeoff checklist, activated the coming approach in the FMC, and completed the approach checklist, all whilst the trainee was handling the aircraft manually. The captain then turned off the flight directors and activated an indicator known as the flight path vector to help give the student some guidance, and then briefed him about the landing that was coming up. Once the aircraft passed the touchdown point, they started timing for 3 seconds for every 100 feet they were above the ground, meaning about 54 seconds from 1800 feet, minus 1 second for each knot of tailwind. Since this was a touch and go maneuver, the aircraft had been left in flaps 1 configuration, so once the timing was out, flaps 2 was then selected together with gear down and eventually flaps 3 as the aircraft started descending. Now here, the Airbus manual also stipulated that the spoilers should be armed for landing, but like I mentioned earlier, this was not in the SmartLynx manual, so the captain decided to keep the spoilers down since they would only need to be lowered immediately after landing anyway. Now, this might seem like a logical thing to do, but the spoilers actually play an important role in all landings, and that is to spoil the lift from the wings on touchdown to keep the aircraft from bouncing, and in normal conditions also to bring more weight onto the brakes. Anyway, the aircraft continued towards the final, and as the trainee was making the final turn, the captain selected full flaps, completed the landing checklist, and reminded the trainee to not select brakes or reversers after landing. The first officer replied that he had understood this, and then they just continued descending. The first landing was nicely executed, and once the nose wheel was safely down, the captain continued according to plan by calling "stand them up," moving the flaps to 2, and then grabbing onto the trim wheel as it was approaching 1 unit nose up. And completely unbeknownst to the pilots, now something really strange happened. As the captain grabbed the trim wheel, the override mechanism started moving to stop the trimming, but the piston that was supposed to activate the associated micro switches was not moving as quickly as it should. This sent unreliable signals to the flight control computer, ELAC 2, that was currently in charge, triggering a switch over to the backup computer. But since the backup, ELAC 1, also received the same signals, this computer now also failed, and that sent the system down another notch, activating SEC 2 and alternate law. Now the pilots had no idea that this was happening at this point, since the caution would only appear later as they passed 1500 feet climbing. Anyway, the trainee pushed the thrust levers into the toga detent again, and soon the aircraft had accelerated past the approach bug and the captain called rotate. The rest of the maneuver continued just like the first takeoff, and when the trainee leveled at about 1500 feet, the master caution warning went off together with a single chime, and the information about the failure popped up on the ECAM displays. Now the information shown said ELAC 1 and 2 pitch fault, and informed the pilots that they were operating in alternate law. The captain took up the quick reference handbook and read through the procedures, which simply instructed a computer reset of each of the ELAC computers, something that was relatively easy and quick to do. So once this was done, the aircraft functioned just like normal again, so the captain decided just to continue with the exercises. The second touch and go landing went out without any issues and warnings, but after the third landing, once the aircraft was back up at circuit altitude, the same warnings appeared again. Now, after the captain had again reset the computers, he tried looking for any guidance on limitations to the number of resets that were allowed, but couldn't find any in the Airbus manuals. If this would have been a normal line flight, he would have likely asked engineering for guidance, but since there was no specific guidance in the minimum equipment list, the aircraft was working perfectly fine, and this was not the revenue flight, he instead again decided to continue. The rest of the training session with the first trainee was completely uneventful, and after the last landing, they did a full stop and taxied off the runway to change over to the next student. The second trainee then climbed into the right seat, and the exercises started all over again. For the second student, there were less issues. Only once did the ELAC 1 failure occur, and since this was only a singular failure, there was no lower reversion and no cautions, just an ECAM message letting the crew know that it had happened. The captain reset the system a third time and then just continued. So, what was actually going on here? Well, it was later noticed that the reason that the override piston inside of the trim mechanism wasn't moving correctly was because of presence of a non-approved oil inside of the cylinder. This oil had a viscosity almost twice as high as the correct oil would have had, which impeded the piston from correctly activating the microswitches. But remember, the only time that this piston should have had to be used in normal circumstances would be during a runaway stabilizer event, where the pilots would need to stop the incorrect movement of the stab trim manually. And since that was such a rare event, and it really is, this system was hardly ever used, nor was it tested during routine maintenance checks, so we will actually really never know when this faulty oil was introduced to the system or by whom. Now, had it only been for this small system issue, this would not have become such a serious incident, but soon some additional things were going to happen in such a bizarre way that I couldn't really believe it when I first read it. When the second student had finished all of his landings, the third student took place in the cockpit, and it is in his session that the first really important mistakes will occur that will ultimately lead to this accident. The session started normally with a takeoff climb to 2,000 feet and then a right turn to start the exercises. After the first landing, the same problem reoccurred as the captain was setting the stabilizer trim, meaning that once again the ELAC-1 failure appeared downwind. The captain reset the computers, as he was getting quite used to doing at this point, but since these failures continued to pop up at altitude, he never really connected them with his use of the stabilizer trim override mechanism, which only happened on the ground. Anyway, the second landing went very well without any failures, but on the third landing, again it appeared, but this time it was also associated with a single chime for some reason. The investigators were never able to find out why this chime activated, since it was still only a single ELAC failure, but in any case the computer was again reset and the exercises continued. After the fourth landing, the same ELAC-1 failure appeared, this time without that single chime that had happened before, but curiously, this time the computer was never reset. It is highly likely that whoever started working on the ECAM message this time accidentally pressed the clear key instead of doing the reset. And since this was not a critical fault, the message would then be hidden until someone pressed the recall button for at least 3 seconds, something that would normally only happen, according to standard operating procedures, as part of a full pre-flight for the next full flight. This meant that the aircraft now continued to fly in normal law, but with one ELAC already inoperative, and without that being shown to the pilots. During the fourth landing, ELAC-2 again became inoperative, and since ELAC-1 was already down, this meant that the control dropped down to the SEC computers, and the aircraft went into alternate law. Again, that triggered the master caution, the chime and the ECAM, but this time the failure of ELAC-1 stayed hidden, so that when the captain reset ELAC-2, the aircraft reverted to normal law, but with ELAC-1 still inoperative. The third student finished his session successfully, and it was now time for the fourth and last student. And as everyone has probably already figured out by now, this is where the accident will finally happen. The fourth trainee took over the controls and got ready for his first takeoff, completely unaware that one of the flight control computers was now already inoperative. The students had all been sitting in the passenger seats in the cabin during the sessions of the others, so none of them had seen these warnings before. At 14:25 UTC, the thrust levels were again moved into the TOGA detent, and the aircraft started rolling down the runway. The first circuit went fine, but during the second touch and go, the ELAC-2 failure were again triggered for the same reason as before. When they reached circuit altitude, the warning went off and the captain reset the computer, but again without resetting ELAC-1. Now remember how I said before that I would reveal a new function connected with the Airbus control laws? Well, it turns out that direct law is not actually the lowest law available. In case of some truly catastrophic conditions, like the loss of 5 flight control computers after a complete power failure, for example, the aircraft could revert into something known as mechanical backup. In mechanical backup, the aircraft can still be controlled in pitch, but only through the use of stabilizer trim and thrust lever movements, and if it would also be activated in roll by the use of rudder pedals. In this condition, the elevators will be moved into a neutral position and the pilot's side stick becomes completely useless. If this would happen, there would be a more serious cricket warning going off together with a master warning and ECAM messages, but nothing would actually state mechanical backup. Instead, a man pitch trim only message will appear on the primary flight displays in front of the pilots, as well as a man pitch trim on the ECAM screens. This would obviously be a very bad situation to be in, and the possibility of this happening had been deemed so remote that pilots only had to practice it whilst in the cruise in the simulator after a complete loss of generators, and never with any maneuvering needed, and definitely not any takeoff and landings. So with that in mind, let's now go into the fourth touch and go for the last trainee. As the aircraft entered the final approach, everything looked completely normal, but during the last few tens of feet before landing, the descent rate went up just a little bit higher than on the previous approaches. This meant that as the aircraft touched down, it did so a little bit harder than before, and since the captain had deactivated the spoilers, this led to a slight bounce that lasted just over 1 second, starting at 15:04 and 55 seconds. Now, remember how I said that the flight control computers were divided into a commanding and monitoring channel? Well, it turns out that the internal clocks in those two channels weren't completely in sync with each other, and that was by design by Airbus. But the insane problem that now occurred was that since the bounce lasted for just about 1 second, and the input signals that the weight and wheel switches on the main landing gear sends to the SEC computers updated every 1.02 seconds. This meant that the command channel now still felt that the aircraft was airborne, and the monitoring channel sensed that it was on the ground. This would have been completely impossible if the bounce was any longer or any shorter, but now it meant that one computer channel was measuring side stick inputs as if the aircraft was in the air, and the other expected them to be on the ground mode, where the inputs were much smaller. And since both SEC computers were fed the same information, both of them noticed the discrepancy and simply shut down. This meant that the scene was now set for the accident, but it was still not set in stone. For that to happen, it required the captain to again stop the stabilizer trim manually, for the intermittent piston fault to again appear, and deactivate ELAC 2, which was now the only remaining flight control computer. And of course, this is exactly what happened at time 15:05 and 10 seconds. At that time, the captain had already given the order to the first officer to go, which meant that the toga thrust had now been set, and they were therefore completely committed to the takeoff. As ELAC 2 shut down, the warning crickets and lights came on just as the captain called rotate, and because all flight control computers had now stopped working, the aircraft had gone into mechanical backup in pitch. What this meant was that the poor trainee now tried to pull back on his side stick to rotate the aircraft, but this made no difference at all since the elevators was moving to neutral, making the side stick completely useless in pitch. The stabilizer, which had been moving towards zero, had, at this point, a slight positive angle of 3.5 degrees, but with a speed of 130 knots, this was still not enough to get the aircraft airborne. The captain saw that the speed was increasing and nothing was happening, but he had obviously not yet understood what was happening to his aircraft. He called out, "Rotate! Rotate!" to which the trainee desperately responded that he was. The aircraft continued to accelerate to 152 knots, and when the horizontal stabilizer finally stopped moving, it had a nose-up angle of 1.5 degrees, which was just enough to get the aircraft airborne. They now slowly started climbing, with the first officer's side stick in the almost full aft position, but making no difference whatsoever. 2 seconds into the flight, the captain started moving his own side stick, which triggered a dual input warning, and he then pushed the priority button and called out, "I have controls." Remember, this was still only a few seconds into this event, and by taking over the controls, the captain was responding correctly. But now, he was faced with a situation that he had never seen before, nor had he been trained for. His aircraft, which had up until this point worked almost perfectly, was now completely impossible to control using normal means, and he just couldn't figure out why. Like I said, the decision to reject or continue the takeoff had already been taken when the fault appeared, and they were now airborne. It is likely that this sudden increase in workload and stress was what caused the captain to now take a few rapid bad decisions, which would make this situation truly catastrophic. Because about 4 seconds after he had taken controls, the thrust levers were momentarily moved back to the idle position before being pushed back up again. And as that was happening, the flaps were also moved from position 2 to 1, possibly in a futile attempt to try to affect the pitch. But when that happened, the aircraft was at 19 feet, slightly climbing with a pitch of 2.8 degrees nose up. But this sudden decrease in thrust and flaps meant that the aircraft now started reducing the pitch, and after it had reached a maximum altitude of 48 feet, it now started descending at the same time as the captain asked for gear up. The trainee first officer responded, obviously completely overwhelmed by the situation, so he simply did what he was told and selected the gear lever up, causing the gear to start transitioning. About 4 seconds later, the aircraft impacted the ground about 200 meters away from the runway end, with the gear still partially extended. It touched down with 2.85 G, which is a pretty hard impact, and this, combined with the partially retracted gear, caused both of the engine nacelles to slam into the asphalt. But since the nose gear was still out at this point, the impact caused a bounce movement of the nose that pushed it back up into the air. The engines were both now back in toga, producing full thrust, and since the speed had been around 190 knots when the impact occurred, this forced the airliner back into the air with a terrifying climb rate of around 6,000 feet per minute. Now, things started to look really, really bad. Neither the captain nor the first officer had at this point managed to figure out what was going on, and none of them had seen the manual pitch trim only message on their primary flight displays. The aircraft was now pitching up with 19 degrees with a speed of 207 knots when suddenly the flaps also locked up. On top of that, the impact of the number 2 engine had ruptured internal components, and the sparks created from the impact had started an engine fire, which triggered all of the associated warnings inside of the cockpit. This was clearly heading towards a disaster, but thankfully, now the safety pilot who was sitting behind the captain started speaking up. He called out, "Manual pitch trim only! Manual pitch trim only!" And that got the captain back into the loop, and he now started moving the trim wheel forward. He also brought the thrust levers back, and the combined effect of both of those actions meant that the pitch now finally started decreasing and getting back under some type of relative control. But obviously, this was far from over. At time 15:05 and 53 seconds, less than a minute into this emergency, the aircraft reached its highest altitude of 1,590 feet. From then on, it started pitching down again, and it was soon in a 7,200 feet per minute descent. The captain moved the thrust to toga again whilst moving the trim wheel in the opposite direction, and remember, flying an aircraft with trim only is not easy, as there's always a delay to the effect, and this was not something that they had been trained for doing. The aircraft's ground proximity warning system was now calling out "Sink rate, pull up, terrain, terrain, too low, terrain," and on top of that, all of the cricket warnings and lights associated with the blazing engine fire was still sounding. This was an absolutely crazy situation, and to think that the captain was now sharing the cockpit with a poor brand new cadet doing his first ever flight in the aircraft makes this absolutely heartbreaking. The lowest point that the aircraft reached during this massive dive was around 600 feet before the captain again regained control and got the aircraft climbing back up to about 1,200 feet. The status of his aircraft at this point was that both engines were severely damaged, with engine 2 still on fire, pitch control was in mechanical backup and roll in direct low, and on top of that, the flaps were locked in position. Not a great day. The captain tried to send out a mayday call but failed to get it to transmit during the commotion, but the safety pilot now started reading out the ECAM warnings, and this seemed to have a calming effect on the crew. Often when faced with complete chaos, it's a great idea to return back to basics and continue to follow familiar procedures. And that's because the human mind is just not equipped to process this much information at once, but it can allow to follow familiar tasks. At time 15:06 and 58 seconds, 2 minutes into this emergency, the captain again tried to send out an emergency call, but now the safety pilot instead asked to take over the communication, letting the captain concentrate on just flying. And after he had taken over, he finally managed to transmit that first Mayday call into air traffic control. He advised them that they had flight control fail, and the captain told him to ask if they could make a right turn straight back to land on the opposite runway instead. This was immediately approved by the tower, and the captain now started visually turning right to align with the final. At the same time, he also asked the student to change seat with the safety pilot, and the student quickly debuckled his seatbelt, stood up, and together with the CAA inspector moved back into the cabin and strapped in. Now, it was up to the 2 remaining pilots to try and get this stricken bird down on the ground in one piece. The safety pilot started by pushing the master fire warning button, which got rid of the visual warnings as well as the crickets. This would have made the cockpit environment much more bearable, and with that greatly reduced the stress. The captain asked what the runway heading was for runway 26, and the safety pilot responded 262 degrees, whilst he also set that up into the flight management computer. He then continued by informing air traffic control about the engine fire so that they could alert the fire brigade, and he also told the controllers that they were definitely going to try and land on runway 26. Now came the time to try and deal with the problem, so the safety pilot suggested to the captain that they should reduce power on the still burning engine number 2. But here, the high experience of the captain really started to shine through, because he now told the safety pilot that he would prefer to use the 2 engines he had for as long as possible and hopefully have them available for landing rather than shutting one of them down now. Not dealing with an engine fire would feel very counterintuitive for any pilot, but the golden motto, aviate, navigate, communicate, always takes precedence, and in this case the engines were not only needed in order to provide propulsion but also for pitch control, so this decision makes complete sense. At time 15:09, the captain asked for gear down as he started his descent down towards the runway. But only 19 seconds later, engine number 2 finally gave up and failed, as the fire had now completely destroyed several of its vital components. The safety pilot informed the captain that engine number 2 has failed, which the captain acknowledged whilst just continuing to aim for the runway as best as he could. The loss of one of the engines would have made the pitch control even more difficult. A few seconds later, the captain confirmed gear is down and asked for flaps 3. The safety pilot moved the flaps to 3, but it's unclear from the report if the flaps actually started moving or not. But what we do know is that 7 seconds after this, engine number 1, the only remaining engine, also failed due to the auxiliary gearbox seizing up. And this cut off all power to several of the aircraft systems, including the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder. In theory, this loss of both engines should have also removed all power from the hydraulic motors, moving the horizontal stabilizer, which was now the only remaining means of pitch control, but somehow this didn't happen. It is possible that engine number 2 continued to windmill and that this was enough to maintain minimum hydraulic power. The ram air turbine, or RAT, deployed after a few seconds, which meant that some systems came back, and when they did, the first officer stated, "Gear is down, we don't have engines," and then he started reading out the airspeed. 150, 130, 120. And at time 15, 10 and 12 seconds, the aircraft finally touched down hard, just about 150 meters short of runway 26. The touchdown was so hard that all main tires immediately burst, but the aircraft still reached the runway in one piece, where it started decelerating and then finally veered off to the left, where it came to a stop, just a few meters to the side of the runway. Everyone was alive and a true miracle had just happened. The investigation quickly honed in on the fact that there were little guidance available in the SmartLynx training manual regarding the continuation of training with reoccurring faults, and since there was no limitation from Airbus on the number of times that the computers could be reset, there was no real reason for the captain to discontinue the training. The fact that the captain decided to disarm the spoilers for each approach was what led to that small bounce that triggered the last couple of faults, but again, this was not specifically forbidden in the manual. Airbus has, after this incident, introduced numerous software improvements, and they have forbidden the reset of any ELAC computer in flight. The SmartLynx manuals have also been updated to reflect much clearer guidance for base training and also for general dispatch. What happened on this flight just shouldn't have been possible. The sequence of events needed to create this nightmare was so outlandish that no one would believe it if it wasn't for the fact that it actually happened. Stay tuned. The story I'm about to explain started out as a completely normal flight with the South Korean flag carrier Korean Air. Among its many routes, Korean operates a regularly scheduled passenger service from Seoul Incheon International Airport down to Mactan Cebu International Airport on the Philippine island of Cebu. And on the 23rd of October 2022, this flight was being operated by a 24-year-old wide-body Airbus A330, which as a type is a decades-old reliable workhorse. The crew for this flight included a captain who knew the A330 better than most. At 52 years old, he had accrued around 13,000 flying hours, of which more than 9,200 had been flown on the A330, and that meant that he had spent most of his flying career on it. His first officer on this particular day was 37 years old and significantly less experienced. He had accumulated around 1,600 flying hours in total, with a little over 1,000 flown on the A330, so even though he wasn't massively experienced, he had also flown the majority of his career on this awesome old aircraft. Now, in addition to the two pilots, there were also 9 cabin crew and 162 passengers on board the flight, giving a total head count of 173. Now, before departure, the flight crew reviewed the dispatch paperwork, the technical log, as well as the weather. The forecast showed that the conditions were going to be fine for most of their route, but it looked like some cumulonimbus, thunderstorm cells, would be present over the Cebu area around the time of their scheduled arrival, which was a little after 2200 local time. With thunderstorms around, the pilots planned to perform an RNP approach into Mactan Cebu Airport since the ILS was not working, and they would have also anticipated turbulence, poor visibility, and even a possible diversion if things got really bad. It is always quite tricky to plan for arrivals around thunderstorms, as the weather can be completely fine, but also well below landing minimums, depending on where those storm cells turns up. So generally, in conditions like that, we pilots add a minimum of around 15 to 20 minutes of extra fuel to enable us to wait for a storm to pass. But in this case, the conditions weren't forecasted to be nearly bad enough to prevent the crew from actually dispatching, and the technical log also showed that there were no particular issues with the aircraft. So this meant that at approximately 18:05 Philippine time, Korean Air Flight 631 lined up on the runway at Seoul Incheon Airport and then took off normally into the evening sky, with the captain operating as pilot flying and the first officer as pilot monitoring. But these pilots had no idea that deep inside their Airbus A330's hydraulic system, a fault was now lurking, one that hadn't been recorded in the tech log nor anywhere else. In fact, no one even knew that this type of fault could occur until after this flight. Anyway, this issue that will soon come to play a major role in this story had to do with the alternate brake hydraulic system. So before we go any further, we should probably have a look at what that actually is. The Airbus A330 has 2 brake control systems, normal and alternate, to maintain redundancy by also using 2 different hydraulic systems. Like all airliners, the A330 has several independent hydraulic systems in order to ensure that critical systems remain at least partially operable if one of the systems would fail. On Airbus aircraft, these systems are identified using the colors green, blue and yellow, and in the case of the normal brakes, the green system is normally used. But if that system would fail, well then the blue system will jump in. So braking using the green system is called normal braking, and braking using the blue system is therefore referred to as alternate braking. Now, the basic structure of any hydraulic system includes several different elements whose roles we really need to understand here for this story to make any sense. Firstly, the pressure in the system comes from a pump that forces the fluid through the hydraulic lines, and the actual supply of hydraulic fluid is then maintained from a reservoir. The line that feeds hydraulic fluid from the reservoir into a valve or an actuator is called the service line, and conversely, the line that carries hydraulic fluid back to the reservoir after the actuators is called the return line. So in that way, a hydraulic system is a lot like an electrical circuit. The fluid is propelled out of the reservoir through an actuator that moves something like the brakes or the flaps, and then it returns to the reservoir via the return line. Now, there are a lot of different components that the hydraulic fluid passes through on the way towards the brakes in this case, and the one that we need to talk about here is a device called the Park Hydraulic Manifold. This manifold is the first place that hydraulic fluid goes into as it moves from the reservoir towards the brakes, and its purpose is to divert some hydraulic fluid into the accumulators to supply pressure into the parking brake and emergency brake when there is no power in the system. Now, I mentioned the parking and emergency braking system before, but what I want to focus on right now is a small safety feature within the Park Hydraulic Manifold called the Pressure Release Valve, or PRV. The PRV is designed to prevent damage to the hydraulic system in the event of an overpressure, which could occur if there's a blockage that prevents fluid from reaching the return line, for example. So when the pressure on the service side of the PRV reaches a value that is sufficiently far above the normal system operating pressure, this valve will open, releasing hydraulic fluid directly from the Park Hydraulic Manifold into the return line, where it then flows back into the reservoir. Now, that sounds benign enough, but what no one knew was that on this particular aircraft, this PRV had suffered damage at some point during the airplane's 24-year-old service history, unknown when and how. This damage, in combination with a loose spring, allowed the PRV to open when the service pressure was equal to the normal operating pressure, which basically meant all the time. And in this condition, the PRV leaked hydraulic fluid back into the return line at the rate of around half a liter per minute. Now, I know you might be thinking, how is it possible that a hydraulic leak like that could continue without anyone noticing? And the answer to that was that this was an internal leak, and since it was just leaking back into the return line, the hydraulic fluid never actually left the system. So the only effect this leak would have was on the rate of brake accumulator pressure loss when the aircraft was parked. You see, the brake accumulators essentially store hydraulic pressure while the hydraulic pumps are running in order to maintain pressure on the parking brake later after electrical power to the aircraft has been turned off. This pressure then naturally bleeds away over the course of a few hours, which is why, when we park an aircraft overnight, we have to make sure that we put shocks around the wheels to keep the aircraft from start moving when the brakes eventually release. Now, hydraulic fluid from the brake accumulators has to pass through the Park Hydraulic Manifold, where, in this case, some of it was leaking back into the reservoir via the loose PRV, causing the accumulator pressure to run down faster. But because a loss of accumulator pressure was expected, and no one was monitoring how fast this was happening, there was almost no way for pilots or the engineers to notice that the pressure on this aircraft was running down faster than normal. Now, if the brake accumulator pressure would be low when the pilot started the plane back up again, standard procedure on the Airbus A330 was just to turn on the hydraulic pumps and repressurize the accumulators, which is a totally normal thing to do before the first flight of the day. And there certainly wasn't any requirement to report this low accumulator pressure in the technical log. In fact, it would probably have been quite weird to do. As a result, there was no indication available to the flight crew that would prompt maintenance to take a look at the PRV. And checking the PRV's opening pressure also wasn't part of any routine maintenance activity for the Airbus A330, so it wouldn't be checked unless someone reported a problem, which for the reasons that I just explained, nobody would. So knowing this, you can now see how a fault like this may lie dormant inside of the system for years, maybe even decades, basically just waiting for it to become relevant somehow. And it soon would. Back aboard Flight 631, everything seemed perfectly normal as the crew monitored the aircraft through the cruise phase and soon started preparing for their coming approach into Cebu. As they were getting closer, the wind initially favored runway 04, so the crew set up and briefed for the RMP approach to that runway. But as they were descending and before actually reaching the start of the approach, air traffic control informed them that the wind had now suddenly shifted to favor the reciprocal, runway 22 instead. This is pretty common when there are thunderstorms around, since they can quickly affect the strength and direction of the wind, so the pilots in this case agreed to switch to runway 22 in order to avoid having to land with a tailwind. And after quickly having rebriefed for that new approach, they started receiving radar vectors and soon intercepted the inbound course and path for runway 22 successfully. Despite the darkness and stormy weather, they were soon able to see the runway well before their decision height, and the captain therefore decided to continue the approach. But then, at a very low altitude, a heavy rain shower moved in front of them, causing the crew to completely lose sight of the runway. The captain reacted immediately by executing an go-around, and that was then flown perfectly according to the published procedures. And after having completed the relevant checklist and talked to the cabin crew and passengers, the pilots were soon vectored back towards the start of the approach in order to give it another try. This, by the way, is why it's a good idea to carry some extra fuel in these kind of stormy circumstances, as it is really nice to have the option to fly several different approaches, since storm clouds often move out of the way relatively quickly. In any case, Flight 631 soon intercepted the RMP a second time and started descending down towards runway 22. But another storm cell was now approaching the airport, meaning that once again the approach started to go wrong at a relatively low altitude. When flying an approach, we always have to maintain certain stabilization criteria in order to make sure that we're on track for a safe and controlled landing. That means that below 1,000 feet on approach, if we are inside clouds, or latest at 500 feet if we are visual, we must have the aircraft fully configured for landing, power levels correctly positioned with the correct speed and descent rate, on glide path, and with no major control inputs required in order to stay on course for the touchdown zone. Now, it can be a little bit tricky to adhere to that last point when there is gusty winds or turbulence like it was in this case, especially after turning off the autopilot, which we normally do just before we reach our minimums. If the wind pushes the plane off the glide path, we instinctively want to use our controls to regain the glide path, but when we do that, it's super easy to overcorrect, since the winds can change faster than the plane responds to our control inputs. That can in turn lead to the pilot chasing the descent path, repeatedly rising above and falling below it due to the control inputs being out of phase with the turbulence or inertia of the aircraft. Now, to avoid this, one technique is to just aim for a particular vertical speed instead, normally around 750 feet per minute. But if that's not enough, well, then it's normally better to just go around. But it can be hard to suppress the instinct to chase the path, and it's worth noting here that while this captain was very experienced, he had spent most of his career flying long haul, so he might not have had quite as much landing experience as his number of hours would suggest. Anyway, as Flight 631 came in for its second approach, the captain disengaged the autopilot as he normally did, only to find himself fighting significant turbulence at the height of only 300 feet above the ground. And for reference, that's about 25 seconds before touchdown. Feeling the gusty winds pushing them below the path, he instinctively pitched up, which caused the plane to rise back above the descent path once the gust subsided. He then reacted to that by pushing forward on his side stick to lower the nose, which caused the descent rate to increase to 1,000 feet per minute, a bit more than what we want at such a low altitude. This caused the plane to quickly go below the path, meaning that at 150 feet, the captain again pitched up to correct. But at that moment, the wind suddenly shifted from a crosswind to a tailwind, accompanied by a downdraft with a velocity of about 500 feet per minute. Because of that, his pitch up input was now insufficient to reduce the descent rate, and it became clear that the approach was no longer stabilized. The first officer, who was monitoring the instruments and noticed that they were now sinking fast, called out, "Sink rate, go around, just like he should in that situation. Outside, the poppy lights on the runway were now showing 4 glaring red lights, indicating that they were now dangerously low. A split second later, the ground proximity warning system also called out "sink rate," just as the captain pulled his side stick back and pushed the power levers forward in order to start executing the go-around. But by the time that the first officer made that go-around call, they were less than 75 feet above the ground, and there just wasn't enough altitude left to pull it off without first touching down. Now, if the crew had initiated the go-around just 1 second earlier, none of the subsequent events would have taken place, which just shows how small the margins can be this close to touchdown. This is why it is so important to always adhere to the stabilized criteria below 500 feet. Now, I think that the pilots were doing their best here and also reacted reasonably quickly, but unfortunately in aviation, sometimes split seconds really do matter. Because as the engines were now accelerating towards go-around thrust, Flight 631 touched down with its main landing gear just a couple of meters short of the paved surface of runway 22. Now, the edge of the paved runway surface was raised above the surrounding grass due to soil erosion and lack of maintenance, and this had created a sharp step measuring about 15 centimeters of height. What this meant was that as Flight 631 now contacted the ground, its right main landing gear now slammed directly into this step, sending a massive shock shuddering through the entire aircraft. The impact pushed the right main gear shock absorber all the way up into the stop, but even that wasn't enough. The collision was so violent that it exceeded what the gear assembly had been designed to withstand, and like on most modern airliners, the A330 has articulated main gear bogies that tilt so that the aft pair of wheels touch down first, followed by the front pair, which helps to make the landing smoother. This tilting system is controlled by a hydraulic actuator that moves a pair of articulated links attached to the aft part of the bogie beam. So when the bogie impacted this step, the aft end of the bogie was forced upwards with so much force that it pulled the articulation mechanism downwards beyond its maximum range, which in turn caused the lower articulation links to break clean in half. This then allowed the forward end of the bogie to travel upward until it bounced off the surrounding structure, causing the bogie to swing back the other way as the airplane lifted into the air. The aft end with the aft wheels attached to them now swung upwards past its maximum travel range until it slammed into several crucial components, including the brake manifold and the hydraulic lines from both the blue and the green systems. This overtravel also ripped out multiple electrical harnesses that carried the wiring for all major sensors on the right gear, including those that measure wheel RPM, weight on wheels, and the actual position of the bogie. After the aircraft had bounced back into the air, the flight crew carried out the rest of the go-around procedure as they climbed towards a safe altitude. Now, they knew that they had touched down briefly, but they had no idea that the aircraft was badly damaged. And this was because, in order to prevent distractions during critical phases of flight, all except the most serious warnings are inhibited below 1500 feet. But as they climbed through 1500 feet, a whole slew of fault messages suddenly appeared on their electronic centralized aircraft monitor, ECAM, and that finally made them realize the full scope of their problems. Using the standard callouts, the captain now asked for ECAM actions, and the first officer started reading off the first ECAM item, landing gear LGCIU 1 and 2. This indicated that the two landing gear control interface units were both having problems, and they are a pair of redundant computers who aggregate data about the landing gear, provides that information to other computers, and transmit commands back to the landing gear control systems. The LGCIUs receive data from independent sensors and electrical harnesses on each landing gear bogie, but in this case, the severe impact to the right main gear had disconnected the electrical harnesses that were supplying sensor data to both of these LGCIUs. This meant that they could now no longer determine whether the right main gear was up or down, what position the bogie was in, whether the gear was on the ground or not, or if the wheels were even spinning. And that lack of inputs was what had triggered the LGCIU fault messages that now popped up on the ECAM. Now, because the LGCIUs were unable to determine whether the right main gear was up or down, when the first officer had moved the landing gear lever up during the go-around, the gear hadn't actually retracted and was therefore still hanging out. But the pilots had no idea about that, and although one might think that the lack of gear retraction sound would be obvious, in a situation with loads of different distractions like this, it's actually much easier to notice something that is there but shouldn't be than something that should be there that isn't. If the pilots would have looked at their fuel flow, they would have noticed that it was significantly higher than it should be, but that didn't happen. Anyway, reading off the ECAM actions for the LGCIU faults, the first officer stated, "For landing with gear extension, normal extension, try, if unsuccessful, landing gear gravity extension only." The crew then scrolled down to reveal the next ECAM warnings, this time normal brake fault and anti-skid fault. Now, if we go back to talking about normal and alternate brakes again, normal brakes uses safety features like auto brakes and anti-skid, but alternate braking is instead fully manual with fewer or even no automated protections. The anti-skid system, which is similar to the ABS system on your car, compares wheel RPM to the aircraft's ground speed in order to detect a skid, and it then releases brake pressure if a skid is sensed, allowing the wheel to stop the skid and therefore maximizing brake efficiency. But the disconnection of the LGCIU wiring harnesses had resulted in a loss of data from all 4 right main wheel tachometers, which in turn had disabled the anti-skid system since it couldn't determine whether the wheels were spinning or not. And that loss of anti-skid protection then prompted an automatic switchover from normal braking to alternate braking, without anti-skid. And that was what had now generated the normal brake fault ECAM message that I mentioned before. As this message appeared, the captain stated that he was worried about the brakes, and the first officer read off the associated ECAM actions, which warned the pilots not to apply more than 1000 psi of brake pressure with the pedals in order to prevent skidding. Now, if you think that this starts to sound bad, just wait, because this wasn't even close to the end of the side effects from this landing gear damage. Soon, another ECAM message also warned the pilots of a thrust reverser fault, which would also prevent the use of reverse thrust during the landing, and this had in turn been caused by the loss of all weight-on-wheel sensors for the right main gear. You see, when there is a discrepancy between the weight-on-wheel indications from the right and the left main gear, the flight computers must assume that the airplane is still airborne. And because of that, they must also lock out the thrust reversers to prevent a single faulty weight-on-wheel sensor from leading to an in-flight reverser deployment. But this also meant that since the computers would remain in flight mode even after the airplane touched down, it would also prevent the A330's ground spoilers from deploying. Much like the thrust reversers, the ground spoilers are only meant for use on the ground, so if the computers can't determine that the plane is on the ground, the spoilers can't be used. And that will obviously significantly increase the required stopping distance, since the brakes are much less effective without the spoilers bringing the weight down. Now, I'm guessing that quite a few of you are inching closer to the screen right now, since you can maybe start to see where this is going, but just wait, it gets even crazier. Flight 631 had now lost normal braking, anti-skid, auto brakes, thrust reversers and ground spoilers, leaving the manual alternate brakes as the only available braking system. So it is no wonder that the captain was worried here, even though I doubt that he understood the full width of this at this point. Anyway, in order to get more information, he now contacted the Korean Air Maintenance Control Center and listed all of the warnings that they were now receiving. And the pilots also discussed whether they had touched down inside or outside of the runway without actually coming to any definitive conclusion. And after a while, once they had gone through the relevant procedures, they then started accepting vectors from air traffic control for yet another approach. Now, the first thing that the pilots did during this third approach was to test whether the landing gear could be lowered, being still unaware that it was, in fact, already down. The first officer used the alternate landing gear extension mechanism to gravity drop the gear, which caused the left main gear and nose gear down lock lights to illuminate, but not the right main gear light, even though that gear was in fact still down and locked. The reason for that discrepancy was simply that there was no data coming from the right main gear position sensors, and noticing the missing light, the captain asked why the gear wasn't coming down, but the first officer, he didn't know any more than the captain, so he could only affirm that one of the lights did not come on. In response to that, the captain told the first officer to request a break away from the approach and instead asked for a clearance to a holding pattern at the Almar waypoint while they tried to sort out this issue. Air traffic control responded and instructed them to climb to 4,000 feet and then proceed direct to Almar, which the crew subsequently did. As they proceeded into the hold, the captain now told Korean Air Maintenance that they had attempted a gravity extension but that the right main gear was indicating unsafe. And as he was doing that, at the same time the first officer proactively looked up the emergency procedure for landing with an abnormal gear and began reading out the steps that they needed to take. This included shutting down the engine on the side of the failed landing gear using the master switch immediately after touchdown in order to minimize the damage in the event that the engine might contact the ground following a landing gear collapse. After they had reviewed all of the steps in this procedure, the captain then called the purser to inform the cabin crew that they were about to perform an emergency landing and that he would issue a brace command 1 minute before touchdown. He then also called Korean Air Operations and informed them that they were making an emergency landing with an unsafe right main gear. And lastly, he called Air Traffic Control, stating, "Mayday, mayday, mayday, Korean 631, landing gear unsafe. We are going to make an emergency landing approach. Please prepare." Now I want to take a few seconds here just to point out that all of the flight crew's actions here were quite professional. A good example of how to handle a situation like this. Yeah, these problems had been caused in part by the pilot's inputs, but once they were faced with these issues, they followed procedures, kept everyone informed, and didn't rush into anything. Good stuff. Anyway, for the next couple of minutes, the captain remained on the radio with operations control in order to finalize their contingency plans before making the next approach. And in this conversation, the crew and operations discussed the possibility of diverting to Davao on the southern island of Mindanao, where the weather was reported to be a little bit better. But in the end, the captain decided that they had plenty of fuel left, so they could make at least one more approach first. Now, one of the things that the pilots did not take into account when taking this decision was the fact that they were now burning fuel at a much higher rate with the landing gear extended. And also that it had never actually retracted after their last go-around, so it is likely that it wouldn't retract after a subsequent go-around either. The report doesn't say whether they had enough fuel to fly to Davao with the gear extended, but given that they had loaded quite a bit of extra fuel in Seoul due to the expected bad weather, it is possible that they could. But this decision to stay for one more approach would end up being much more important than anyone could have known, as you will soon see. Anyway, by this point the crew knew that they would be landing with several braking systems inoperative, but they still believed that they would be able to stop on Cebu's long 10,860-foot runway using the alternate or even the emergency brakes. But what they didn't know was that the hydraulic systems who normally operate those brakes were also compromised. You see, the alternate brakes utilized the blue hydraulic system, which had been breached when the articulated bogie traveled beyond its maximum rotation range. Now, modern aircraft are required to have hydraulic cutoff points or fuses that contain damage from a hydraulic leak before it can actually drain the whole system, and that was indeed the case here as well. These safety valves should activate if hydraulic fluid is leaking at a rate of at least 12 liters per minute, which hadn't happened yet because there wasn't any hydraulic fluid in the brake lines, thanks to a device called the Brake Dual Distribution Valve, or BDDV. The BDDV supplies hydraulic pressure to the brake lines only when braking is being actively applied, which in this case should have prevented any leak from taking place prior to the aircraft actually touching down. Then, when the pilots put pressure on the brake pedals, what should happen is that the BDDV releases fluid into the broken lines. The leak rate rapidly then exceeded 12 liters per minute, and the safety valves would therefore cut off the flow to the right main gear. But since that leak would be contained and there would still be fluid in the system, This would assure that the brakes on the left main gear would still continue to operate. Smart, right? Yes, but it is quite hard to stop with brakes only on one side, since asymmetric max braking can result in a loss of directional control as rudder authority decreases during the rollout. So, with the usable brake pressure on the left side limited this way, and with no spoilers and no reverses, calculations later showed that the runway in Cebu was actually very slightly too short. But if that calculated scenario was what had actually happened, the airplane would have just exited the runway slightly, it would likely have been towed back from the grass onto the gate, and this video might never have been made, and this aircraft would probably still be in service right now. But instead, what made this situation go from very bad to catastrophic was that little insidious latent fault that I told you about in the beginning. Remember that leaky little pressure release valve? Now that valve had been leaking hydraulic fluid back into the return line at the rate of half a liter per minute for years. But when this hard touchdown broke some of the blue hydraulic lines on the right main gear, something had suddenly changed. You see, when the system is fully pressurized, hydraulic fluid entering the return line goes to the reservoir, because that's where everything is normally flowing. But when the return line was broken at the brake level, suddenly the entire stretch from the brakes back up to the reservoir was open to the outside, reducing its internal pressure down to ambient atmospheric pressure. That meant that when the hydraulic fluid escaped from the PRV, it was no longer drawn back up into the reservoir, but rather towards the region of low pressure. So it had now started traveling the wrong way up the return line towards the breach. Along the way, this leaking fluid passed through the BDDV, which, if you recall, was keeping the hydraulic lines on the right main gear unpressurized. But the BDDV didn't stop this leak, because it was only designed to preclude hydraulic fluid from entering the downstream regions via the service supply port. It wasn't designed to prevent fluid from flowing the wrong way up the return line, since that should just never happen. As a result, the leaking fluid was able to flow all the way down to the breach in the return line and then out of the aircraft at a steady rate of half a liter per minute. As the flight crew continued to circle at Almar in order to work through the various ECAM actions, the hydraulic pressure was therefore steadily dropping in the blue system, which supplied the alternate brakes. At time 2300, as Flight 631 was starting its fourth approach, the amount of hydraulic fluid in the blue reservoir had dropped low enough to generate yet another ECAM warning, this time for hydraulic B reservoir low level. The first officer saw this message and called out the associated ECAM action, which was to turn off the blue hydraulic pump in order to prevent more fluid from being pumped out through the breach. The captain acknowledged, and the first officer then reached up and turned off the blue system hydraulic pump. This meant that they now wouldn't be able to use the alternate brakes either, but in theory that wouldn't reduce their overall braking power due to the existence of the emergency brakes, the final redundancy in the brake system. So just to reiterate something that I said near the start of this video, the leaking PRV was located inside the park hydraulic manifold, which was designed to divert hydraulic pressure to the parking brake accumulators, who pressurizes the blue system to hold the brakes on when power to the airplane is turned off. However, in the case that the pilots have to turn off the hydraulic pumps in flight, like they did in this case, the parking brake can also act as an emergency brake, using this residual accumulator pressure, which normally allows for 1 or 2 applications of maximum braking. Now remember how one of the side effects of this PRV leak was that the accumulator pressure decreases more rapidly than normal? Yeah, that's what now happened. Without the pressure from the hydraulic pumps feeding more fluid into the park hydraulic manifold, the only pressure in the system was now coming from the accumulators. So as fluid continued to leak out of the PRV, the brake accumulators now also started quickly depressurizing. In fact, by the time Flight 631 started descending down the glide slope, most of the accumulator pressure was already gone, which meant that the A330 was now left with nearly no brakes at all. But the pilots had no idea about this. Now, I really want to emphasize here just how incredibly rare it is to see so many redundant systems fail. we had the failure of the air-ground indication system, preventing the use of the thrust reversers and spoilers. The failure of the wheel speed transducers that led to the loss of anti-skid and normal braking via the green hydraulic system. This then in turn activated the damaged blue system, and then the latent leak from the PRV caused the loss of both alternate and emergency braking as well. That is just, well, crazy. Anyway, as this approach continued, the pilots were clearly very concerned about the situation, because the captain now said, "Okay, take a look. After landing, if the situation is not going well, take everything off," by which he probably meant cut engine power and hope for the best. But even so, they had no idea just how bad things would turn out to be. And as the giant aircraft started approaching the runway, the captain also made a PA to the passengers to brace for impact. At time 23:07 and 39 seconds, Korean Air Flight 631 touched down at the correct speed and within the touchdown zone of runway 22. The pilots moved the thrust levers to idle, then back to reverse, although the thrust reversers of course did not deploy, and as expected, the spoilers also didn't extend. But the pilots slammed on the emergency brakes anyway, because it was all that they had. However, there was now so little residual pressure left in the accumulators that after just 10 seconds of braking, with the airspeed falling through 107 knots, all pressure was suddenly lost and the brake pedals went completely dead. With no braking systems remaining, the 173 passengers and crew were now left at the mercy of fate. In the cockpit, the pilots now tried everything that they could think of in order to try to get this aircraft to stop. They held the brake pedals down as far as possible with obviously no effect, and the first officer tried to execute the abnormal gear procedure by shutting off the engine on the affected side. But under the extreme stress that he was under, he instead started shutting down the opposite engine by mistake. The captain shouted out, "Do not shut it off!" 7 different times, indicating extreme agitation, as I think we can all understand. And the first officer flipped the master switch back on again, which actually in this case made no difference. With the engines already at idle, shutting them down wouldn't help stopping the plane anyway. As the end of the runway approached through the rainy darkness outside, the captain called out that their speed was not reducing. And then, with a forward speed of 83 knots, that's 152 kilometers per hour, Flight 631 ran off the end of the runway and then started careening across the overrun area towards numerous obstacles in the distance. With the passengers bracing for impact, the nose gear struck a concrete slab supporting the approach lighting system, causing it to collapse, but the plane still did not stop. Continuing forward, it then collided with the localizer antenna and its metal support structure, which was ripped out of the ground and tossed up over the top of the fuselage. And with that antenna still wrapped around it, the Airbus A330 then finally came to a stop, 235 meters beyond the end of the runway, heavily damaged but mostly in one piece. Inside of the passenger cabin, the flight attendants immediately initiated an evacuation through the L2 and R2 doors. The L1 and R1 doors at the front couldn't be used because the forward fuselage had been badly deformed in the crash, while the L3 and R3 doors were blocked by debris from the antennas, and the L4 and R4 doors were too high off the ground due to the collapse of the nose gear. And partway through the evacuation, the R2 door was also taken out after a steel bar had punctured the slide. But thankfully, there was no fire, so the passengers were eventually able to all evacuate through the only remaining door. The cabin crew did an outstanding job during this evacuation by rendering special assistance to passengers in wheelchairs and going back inside the cabin 4 times in order to check that no one was left behind. In the end, only 2 crew members and 15 passengers received minor injuries, but all 173 people on board survived this crazy incident. The airplane, however, was completely written off. Investigators from the Philippines Civil Aviation Authority determined that the increase in vertical speed due to the captain's control inputs and the turbulent downdraft was what had caused the early touchdown. And the main gear's impact with the step at the runway edge had then caused all of the damage that led to the loss of all deceleration mechanisms, so these were both causal factors. The leaky PRV and the design of the low hydraulic quantity procedure, which led to the depressurization of the accumulators, was also listed as contributing factors. Now, a later study presented in the accident report showed that if hydraulic fluid had not leaked out via the PRV, allowing the use of alternate brakes on the left side, the speed of the aircraft as it left the runway would have been reduced from 83 knots down to 30 knots, which would have been significantly safer. As a result of this accident, Korean Air made several improvements to its training program for its pilots in order to improve raw pilot handling skills. And Airbus also began working on new maintenance procedures to catch leaky PRVs, as well as improved thrust reversal logic that would allow the use of reverse thrust should another crew find themselves in a similar situation. But what I really want to emphasize here is that the loss of every single braking system on a modern airliner is something of a black swan event. It is just incredibly improbable, and to my knowledge has never happened before Flight 631. In fact, if I had to guess, I would say that something like this might not happen again for a very, very long time. And the incredible part here is that everyone on board survived what sounds like a worst-case scenario. But was it? Actually, as my team and I were reviewing this story, we noticed that the accident could have been fatal if just one tiny decision had been made differently. And that was the decision to make one more approach before diverting to Davao. You see, Davao's runway is 1,000 feet shorter than the runway at Cebu, which would have meant an even higher speed when the aircraft departed the runway, but that's not the main thing here. The actual issue is that in the real event, around half of the deceleration that occurred prior to the overrun came from the still remaining residual accumulator pressure. But if the flight had proceeded to Davao, the PRV leak would have kept bleeding off that accumulator pressure until there was none left at all. And in that case, Flight 631 would have likely overrun the runway at Davao at a speed well over 100 knots, which could have caused the aircraft to careen outside of the airport boundary with potentially fatal results. A lot of the training that we pilots go through is done to enable us to act almost automatically when faced with, for example, handling difficulties. But what happens when those automatic reactions becomes the very thing that's causing the problems in the first place? Stay tuned. The pilots who were going to operate Republic Airways Flight 4439 woke up around 9:30 in the morning on November the 6th, 2019. They were staying at a hotel in Detroit after having flown 3 sectors on the previous day, and they were now getting ready to operate the second and last day together on their current roster. The first flight was scheduled at a comfortable 1500 hours local time, which had allowed the crew to have a nice long sleep in, and they reported feeling rested and in good spirit as they took the shuttle bus towards the airport. It was a beautiful day with light winds and almost clear skies, perfect for flying in other words. The captain was 32 years old and had been working with the airline for just over 4 years. He had 4,500 hours of total time, and 3,135 of those were flown on the Embraer 170 family. He was assisted by a 30-year-old first officer who had started with Republic just over a year before the flight. This meant that he was quite new, around 2,300 hours of total time and 677 on the type. The pilots had gotten along well during that previous day, which was the very first time that they had flown together, and on that day the first officer had been pilot flying for 2 out of the 3 legs, which meant that on the second day it was the captain's turn to start and to fly 2 legs. We pilots always try to do an equal amount of pilot flying and pilot monitoring flights in order to get a similar amount of landing and takeoff recency, and also just to keep the work as varied as possible. The only times that we might step away from that principle is if there are operational reasons for it, like bad weather, training, or airport limitations, for example. Now, the aircraft that the crew were going to operate was a 12-year-old Embraer ERJ 170. It is a lovely regional jet with a place for 70 passengers, sporting undermounted engines and a trimmable horizontal stabilizer, which is going to play a big role in this story. Because this particular aircraft had suffered from a long history of issues with its trim system. During the month before the flight, the trim switch on the captain's control yoke had several times stopped working, causing an ACAS warning to the pilots. Every time that had happened, it had been replaced, only for the same warning message to appear a few days or weeks later. These type of intermittent faults can be really annoying for the engineers who have to work with them, because the way that they work is by following a very specific set of instructions depending on what kind of failure that they're facing. And once they have done the work, well, then they will test the system, and if the system says that the fault has been cleared, well, then the aircraft will be released until that same fault manifests itself again. But on the day of this flight, there were no problems reported, and the technical logbook was completely clean. So what was actually going on here? What kind of gremlins were actually present in the trim system causing these intermittent faults? Well, to explain that, we will first need to look into what the pitch trim system actually is and how it works. You see, the pitch trim system is an absolutely crucial component in flying modern aircraft because it enables us to operate in a wide variety of different speeds and weights. The aircraft is primarily controlled around the pitch axis with the use of its elevators. These are little rudders at the back of the horizontal stabilizer, which, when moved, changes the amount of downforce created by the horizontal stabilizer and therefore pitches the aircraft up or down. The problem, though, is that the amount of elevator deflection needed to get the aircraft to pitch changes with different speeds, as well as with the weight and balance of the aircraft. And also, keeping a constant pull or push on the yoke for a long time as the aircraft is climbing or descending is really tiresome for the pilots. And this is where the trimmable horizontal stabilizer comes in. Because once the pilots or the autopilot have used the elevators to achieve the pitch that they want, well, then they can use the trim system to move the entire back wing, the horizontal stabilizer, into a new angle that can maintain this new pitch. This means that the forces on the yoke are reduced until there is no inputs needed at all, and that's what we, pilots, refer to as the aircraft being in trim. During initial pilot training, a lot of effort is put on teaching pilots to always trim the aircraft out, as it becomes much easier to handle and to operate if this is done properly. Every time that the aircraft changes speed, pitch or center of gravity, the aircraft needs to be trimmed out. And on the Boeing 737 you can easily see this happening by those big trim wheels turning, both when the pilots and when the autopilot is flying the aircraft. On the Embraer there are no trim wheels, but instead a movable trim scale showing the angle of the stabilizer. Now, one thing that is really important to remember is that the trimmable stabilizer is very, very powerful because of its size, so it must be kept under strict control throughout the flight. A runaway stabilizer, which is when the stabilizer starts moving by itself, can be very dangerous, as the force needed to override it will quickly become very large. On the Embraer 170, the stabilizer can be controlled in 4 different ways. Either by a split trim switch next to the captain's left thumb on his yoke or on the first officer's corresponding yoke, or by a couple of standby switches on the center control panel, or finally by the autopilot. The reason that the switches are split in 2 is to make sure that the movement of the switch is deliberate by the crew and not caused by, for example, a short circuit in the cable to the switch. If one part of the split switches would indicate a trim input but not the other for more than 5 seconds, a pitch trim switch fail message would appear to the pilots on the ACAS display, and that switch would be disregarded and disengaged for a short period of time. This computer monitors all of the inputs, and it will cut off any input that lasts longer than 3 seconds continuously. These are some of the safety features that are put in place in order to avoid a trim runaway from happening. But if for whatever reason it would still happen, there are also emergency procedures in force for the pilots to follow, including memory items. Now, memory items are actions that the pilots need to commit to memory, and actions straight away in case a particular serious failure happens that is time critical. In the case of a trim runaway, Republic Airways had only one memory item, which was to push the red trim quick disconnect switch on either yoke. That would then stop the movement of the electric motor moving the horizontal stabilizer. After having done the memory items, the crew is then supposed to use the quick reference card. It's a little card containing further actions to be taken, followed by the quick reference handbook for the full failure checklist. We pilots train how to recognize and handle a trim runaway every few years in the simulator, and provided it is caught early, it's generally not a big issue. So that's how the system works and some of the safety features, but it doesn't really explain what was going on with this particular aircraft. Why did the captain's trim switch keep malfunctioning no matter how much the engineers tried to replace components and troubleshoot it? Well, what no one had noticed was that the wiring bundles coming from the trim switch and going down to the trim computer were mounted close to the forward fastening bolt of the captain's yoke. That bolt had been locked into position using a metal wire which had been twisted around itself into a pigtail, but it hadn't been tucked away properly. Instead, the pigtail had started rubbing up against the wire bundle and slowly eating away at the insulation, leading to the wire being exposed and causing occasional short circuits. But of course, the pilots operating on this day knew nothing about this as they were getting ready for their flights. Around 1400 local time, the pilots started their pre-flight preparation in Detroit Metro Wayne County Airport. All the documentation looked really good and nothing really sticking out, so they proceeded to brief their cabin crew and then walked out to the aircraft. Like I mentioned before, the captain would start as pilot flying for the first leg over towards New York, LaGuardia Airport. Then the first officer would take over and fly it to Atlanta, and then finally the captain would bring it back to their home base in LaGuardia again. They started boarding their passengers and around 1500 they departed towards New York. The takeoff and initial climb were completely normal, with the captain hand flying the aircraft during the first couple of thousand feet, just like he normally did. During that first part of any flight, the aircraft will need to go through several pitch changes. It will change from a relatively steep pitch up during the takeoff phase into a lower pitch to accelerate in order for the flaps to be retracted, and then the pitch will be modulated in order to get the speeds needed for the following climb phases. Since the captain was hand flying this segment, he would have constantly needed to be trimming using his trim switch on the yoke, but this is not something that he likely would have thought about. It's just something that he would have done naturally because he would have been so used to it from years of flying. And this is basically similar to what you do when you're out cycling and you need to make a turn. Like, you don't need to think about what you're doing. That's how it feels for us when we're trimming the aircraft. After the aircraft had established itself in cruise and on autopilot, a warning message suddenly appeared on the ACAS display. The message read, "Pitch trim switch 1 fail," again indicating that the captain's trim switch was not working properly. The aircraft was flying fine on autopilot, and the pilots discussed this indication and went through the associated checklist, which really didn't say much other than that the warning was advisory. They saw no reason to switch controls for this failure. Instead, they started preparing for the approach into LaGuardia without thinking much more of it. They initiated the descent, and the captain executed a completely normal approach and landing, during which the trim system worked perfectly fine. When they pulled up at the gate, the captain contacted their maintenance department, telling them about the ACAS warning, and he also entered the failure into the aircraft's technical logbook. This was the start of the sequence that would ultimately lead up to this very serious incident that this video is all about. The engineers quickly arrived to the aircraft and started working on the faulty switch. The pilots were told that the spare switch that was needed was about 20 minutes away in a storage facility, and while the pilots were waiting, the engineers partly removed the old switch. At some point though, whilst the engineers were working, the company must have decided that it was not worth delaying the subsequent 2 flights because of this issue. The aircraft could fly perfectly fine using the backup switches or the first officer system, so instead of finishing the work, the engineers were told to remount the switch, and then they needed to complete what's called a HEAL release. Now, HEAL stands for Hold Item List, and it means that certain non-critical maintenance items can be put onto a list to be fixed later on. Every aircraft manufacturer can decide what items can be safely added to the HEAL list and how long the aircraft can continue to fly with these failures before it needs to be fixed. When a system is put on the HEAL list and before the aircraft is allowed to depart, an INOP sticker, like this one, which you can find on my merch store, must be placed on the inoperative system to remind the crew not to use it. But the problem with doing that on the trim switch is that it's on the yoke, and there really isn't a good way to attach it there, so the INOP sticker was never fitted. There was also no way to deactivate that single switch completely, but since it had been working fine on the way in, it wasn't seen as really a big deal. The pilots were then briefed on the actions that had been taken, and the captain verified that the technical logbook had been properly filled in. No one did a functional test of the switch after it had been remounted because it wasn't supposed to be used anyway. After this, the engineers left the aircraft and the cabin crew started boarding the outbound passengers who were going to Atlanta. The first officer was going to be pilot flying for the following leg, and the aircraft soon pushed back and started their second flight of the day. This flight went off without any kind of problems, and the warning message didn't reappear during that flight. The crew did a standard turnaround in Atlanta, and for the last flight of the day, the captain was once again going to be pilot flying. There were very few passengers booked on this last flight, only 6 of them, so that meant that on the incident flight there was only 9 people on board. 6 passengers, 2 pilots and 1 cabin crew. The takeoff performance was calculated and the pilots decided to do a standard flap 2 departure. And at around 2050 local time, the aircraft pushed back from the gate and started its engines. The latest weather in Atlanta was very nice, with only some light easterly winds, 15 degrees Celsius outside and only thin, very high clouds. The aircraft taxied out, and at time 21:05 the captain advanced the thrust levels and began the takeoff roll on runway 09 left. After takeoff, the aircraft started climbing at a quite high rate, almost 4,000 feet per minute, which wasn't unusual given the very low passenger weight that they were carrying. The captain was again hand-flying the aircraft, and at around 1,500 feet he started pitching the aircraft forward to accelerate in order to start retracting the flaps. He asked the first officer for flaps 1 as the nose started to come down and the speed started increasing. Because of the low weight, the aircraft was climbing with a quite high pitch angle, so he needed to pitch forward quite a bit in order to reduce that. This also meant that he needed to apply some trim, which he did using the trim switches on his yoke, which he had done thousands of times before. Now, that trim switch was not supposed to be used, but he likely completely forgot that, because years of training and force of habit is a really powerful thing. And also, remember that there was no INOP sticker there to remind him. The aircraft now started trimming, but instead of the forces on the yoke getting lesser and lesser, the complete opposite started happening. The controls just kept getting heavier and heavier, and he now needed to push forward using more and more force in order to reduce the climb rate. Now, the natural way for a pilot to react in this case is to continue trying to trim away the forces, but the more he did so, the worse the situation became. The captain looked down on the trim indicator and realized to his horror that it was indeed moving, but not in the way that he wanted to be. The trim was moving more and more into the nose-up position. As this was going on, the first officer initially didn't notice anything. This is one of the issues with the stabilizer trim problem. It needs to be very clearly communicated by the pilot who notices it, because there are no visual or oral warnings of it occurring when the autopilot is not engaged. The captain now did call the first officer to engage the autopilot, but when he tried to do that, it immediately disengaged due to the forces being applied to the captain's yoke. The first officer left the autopilot switch for a while and got ready to switch over to the new air traffic control frequency when the captain suddenly called out, we have a problem. Can you call in an emergency to air traffic control? The first officer, quite understandably, responded, what? Why? What kind of emergency should I call? And the captain said that, I think that we have a runaway stabilizer. At time 21:06 and 53 seconds, the first emergency call was transmitted to Atlanta Tower. The tower responded, asked about the nature of the emergency and offered any assistance that they could provide. When an emergency is called, the aircraft in the emergency will receive absolute priority, and that's exactly what now happened. Atlanta Tower offered the aircraft to turn right for an immediate downwind for an approach into runway 10 or into any runway that they might need, but unfortunately things were not going to be quite that simple. Because in the cockpit, the trim situation was now getting more and more extreme, with the horizontal stabilizer pitching the aircraft up, eventually reaching the maximum 13 degrees nose-up position. At this point, the captain needed to use all of his force to keep the nose from rising higher and higher. He called flaps and then moved the flaps himself into the up position to see if that would resolve the situation, but it didn't help. He then asked the first officer to help him to try and get the nose down, and both pilots now started pushing forward with all of their strength, but the nose just kept rising, and as it did, the speed of the aircraft was quickly reducing. Since the captain had identified the failure as a runaway stabilizer, he now started to execute the memory items, which basically included that he pushed the quick trim disconnect switch on his yoke. He also asked the first officer to try to do the same thing. This stopped the trimming as soon as he pushed the switch, but he likely then left the button a couple of times to try and reverse the up trim with his trim switch, and every time that he did that, the situation just kept getting worse. Both pilots were now using their knees to try and push the nose down, and the captain remembered that he could possibly get the nose down if he put the aircraft into a bank, so that's what he did. The highest pitch recorded during this event was 27 degrees pitch up, and the speed had at that point dropped to 138 knots, very close to the aircraft's stall speed. They now entered into a 45-degree bank turn to the right, which is pretty steep. It's actually the kind of angle that we use to practice steep turns in the sim with. This roll angle enabled the nose to come down slightly, which decreased the climb rate, but it didn't completely fix the problem as the aircraft kept climbing. The captain had the quick reference card in his lap, but he needed both hands in order to keep the aircraft under control, which meant that he couldn't start reading it. But he did remember the previous failure that they had during the first flight, and this led him to believe that it was likely the left side, that was once again causing the trim issue. So he called the first officer to please push the trim cutout switch for the number 1 system on the center pedestal. The problem though was that the trim system was designed to continue to work using all systems if only one of the 2 cutout switches were pressed. The only way to make sure that the electric motor driving the stabilizer was not activated was to push both cutout buttons, but they didn't do that. As the pilots were executing these steep turns, still pushing madly forward and trying to troubleshoot the issue, air traffic control was trying to call them to get updates on what was happening and also to give them vectors for the landing. Several of those calls went unanswered because the pilots were just too focused on flying the aircraft to be able to answer them. But at time 21:08 and 15 seconds, the first officer finally did manage to call air traffic control, basically telling them that they were in a stalling situation. And after that, there were several calls between the tower and the aircraft, and you could just see from the transcripts how much stress the pilots was under during this time. After almost 2 full 360-degree turns, at time 21:10 and 40 seconds, the captain handed over the controls to the first officer. The aircraft was then still turning and climbing through around 10,000 feet, and the emergency had lasted for around 5 minutes at that point. When the first officer got control, he immediately started trying to trim the aircraft forward using his own trim switch. And luckily, it started working, and the forces on the yoke finally started easing off. The aircraft reached its highest altitude of 14,830 feet before the first officer had it fully under control. He then continued a wide right-hand turn and started following the vectors that Atlanta Tower was giving them in order to get back towards runway 10. The captain now looked through the quick reference card, but instead of completing the checklist, they both decided that they had the aircraft under control now and they didn't need to troubleshoot it any further. Now, here it's worth noting that even if the initial actions might have solved the immediate issue, the emergency checklist often contain a lot of good information and considerations, so running through the applicable part of the checklist is always a good idea to do if the time permits. During the vectors, the captain momentarily tried the backup trim switch and it seemed to be working fine, so at time 21:14 and 30 seconds he decided to take back control again from the first officer. It only took a few seconds after he took over before the flight data recorder again started registering several trim up commands coming from the captain's yoke, and he needed once again to start pushing forward in order to control the pitch. This time, however, the pilots reacted quicker and the captain transferred the controls back to the first officer, who could trim the aircraft out. It's unclear why the captain decided to take the controls back at that point, because the first officer clearly had no problems handling the aircraft, but now, there were no mentions about any interactions with the cabin crew and the passengers from the pilots as this was happening, but I imagine that once they had the aircraft under control and they had decided what to do, they must have talked to them, because there's no question that the passengers on this flight would have noticed that something was seriously wrong, and they would have likely been quite distressed. But what was actually going on here? Why did the aircraft's trim start to run away as soon as the captain took over manual controls, but not when the first officer was flying? Well, later examinations of the wiring from the trim switch revealed the damages that I explained to you earlier, but while those damages were the cause for the initial failure messages that the crew had received, they were not the reason for the trim problems that they were now experiencing. No, further examinations of the captain's trim switch showed some unusual indent marks on one side of the switch housing. These marks could only have appeared if the switch had been installed upside down. This meant that it was likely that during the ground stop before the flight, when the engineers had been working on the switch, they had removed it and then quickly reattached it again, but without noticing it, mounting it the wrong way. And since the switch was not deactivated, when the captain started flying the aircraft, his old flying habits kicked in and he started trimming the aircraft using the trim switch. With every trim command that he then gave, the trim would have moved in the wrong way, causing more manual forces to be needed, not less. This caused him to continue to trim to try to get rid of those forces, not noticing the correlation between his own input and the worsening trim situation. The trim system was actually doing precisely what it was told to do, it just didn't match what the captain was expecting from it. This is an almost perfect example of how hard it can be to work against learned muscle memory habits. Now, it might look like it should be quite easy to figure out by us sitting here in a chair watching it, but I can assure you that during the heat of the moment, it is not easy. Once the crew started thinking that the aircraft had a trim runaway, which is a conclusion that the captain drew quite early, it would have been really hard to get out of that mental model. Realizing that the trim was reversed would not have been an obvious conclusion to reach, especially since the switch worked perfectly earlier during the day. Now, it was great to see how they worked together, kept communicating and finally swapped controls, which is what ultimately got them out of this situation. And then to see how ATC provided excellent help throughout this ordeal. At one point, ATC apparently even went out onto the ground frequency, asking if there was any pilots on there that had experience of trim issues on the Embraer 170 and if they could maybe help the emergency crew. One Delta pilot with experience flying the type did come onto the tower frequency and tried helping out by reminding the crew of the memory items, but at that point the aircraft was already under control. Now, I love to see this kind of thinking outside of the box and constructive creativity on behalf of air traffic control. It is great to see. Anyway, the first officer now continued to follow the radar vectors that they were given and descended back towards the airport. He configured the aircraft normally, and since he was now flying, they had no further issues with the trim system. At time 02:25 and 55 seconds, the aircraft landed safely back on runway 10 in Atlanta and then taxied into the gate. The aircraft was then taken out of service and brought in for an extensive troubleshooting. No failures were initially found until those small indents were noticed on the trim switch housing and the reason for the emergency became apparent. It turned out that Embraer had actually issued a service bulletin back in February of 2015 advising operators of the possibility that the trim switch could be installed inverted. A special support was recommended to be fitted in order to fix the issue, and the service bulletin needed to be complied with within 7,500 hours of operation or 36 months, whichever came first. But unfortunately, that had not been done on the incident aircraft. As a result of this investigation, the NTSB recommended Embraer to improve the fitting of the trim system wire bundles to avoid this kind of damage that had occurred on the accident aircraft. They also needed to add new inspections to find these type of issues before they could become a problem, and also both the FAA and the Brazilian authorities needed to enforce these new rules and to make the new fitting of the aircraft trim switch mandatory so it could never be fitted inverted again. The investigation also found that even though the captain knew he shouldn't use the trim switch, it would have been very hard to avoid the deep-rooted habits that he had formed, and that's what led to the incident developing. Because of this, discussions were also held of whether or not it was really a good idea to allow dispatch with a faulty, still activated trim switch. Now, if you like this video, I hope I have earned a subscription from you, and check out this video next, which I think that you're going to find really fascinating, or watch all of my accident videos in this playlist. If you want to support the work that I do, then please consider joining my Patreon crew, send a super thanks, or get yourself some awesome merch. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.